Hello, welcome to Tulsa Community College's show on student success. What's equity have to do with it? So today I'm excited to introduce our guest. My name is Eunice Tarver. I have the pleasure of serving as the provost for TCC's Northeast campus, as well as the assistant vice president for diversity and inclusion. So at this time I'll ask our guests to introduce yourselves.
Hello, my name is Esmeralda Hernandez Hamed. I am a project specialist for the Center for Urban Education, working in partnership with TCC on the Equity Scorecard.
Hello, my name is Debbie Hansen. I'm also a project specialist at the Center for Urban Education. I don't have the pleasure of working directly with TCC. I'm working with other CUE campus partners, but I came along on this trip to be a part of the team's work for this that's happening right now.
We're excited to have you and surprise. Welcome to the show.
I'm Kelly Brassfield. I'm a senior academic advisor for the School of Business and IT here at Metro Campus.
Wonderful, and you're also a member.
Also a member of the TCC and CUE Scorecard team.
Hi, I'm Pat Turner, and I'm the Director of Inclusion Programming here at TCC. Also work closely with the retention specialists, and I'm part of the evidence team for the CUE project, and excited to be here today.
Wonderful. And when we talk about CUE, CUE is part of the University.
So it's part of the University of Southern California. We're housed in the School of Education, and it's directed by Dr. Estela Benzimon. And we've been around for 20 years working with campuses on equity.
Awesome. So today when we're talking about what's equity got to do with it, we're talking about education and equity. And so I think the way that I'd like to kick this off is just to talk a little bit, start with some terminology. So we hear a lot about the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'd like for you guys to share with me, what's your definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is it all the same? Is it different? And how? And so we'll start here.
Sure. So we define equity in two ways, really. We define equity in terms of parity and outcomes for students, and we define equity also as kind of understanding the way that education can, and particularly for racial equity, how education can be a racialized experience, and kind of understanding that to be able to mitigate the barriers that students of color in particular face at institutions like TCC and all institutions. It's different from diversity because, you know, when we talk about diversity, we're talking mostly about access, about an opportunity, so making sure that students come into the door and representation. But what we found, you know, for example, in California, is that students were accessing institutions at high rates, and students of color were accessing institutions at high rates, but they were not completing at, you know, their outcomes were not equitable for when compared to other student groups, and so that's the difference between diversity and equity. It's bringing more students basically to a pathway, but not necessarily making sure that they complete at equal rates from other racial minoritized groups. Inclusion, I think, is a part of equity, but it's not the whole story, right? So, you know, being able to make sure that students feel like they belong, that they feel validated, is a really important part of equity. But we find that you really need that kind of social justice part of equity to really understand what that racialized experience is for students of color in order to really properly be inclusive for those students. So I would say that that's what the difference is for the Center for Urban Education. Do you want to add anything?
So I'm going to come back to you, Debbie, but I'm going to break it up a little bit and come over here to Pat. And so Pat, when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion here at TCC and the work that you do with our students, tell me how you share that information. If you're working with a faculty member or a frontline staff, how do you differentiate that?
I think when we talk diversity, certainly I don't know that I can top your very scholarly answer there, but I'm going to try to put a face on it. When we talk diversity, it's what makes us all unique. So those characteristics from weight, height, religion, education, all of who we are that makes us unique. And I think when we're looking at student success here at TCC and our outcomes, and we're really looking at the data, we know that we have gaps. And so one is understanding diversity, understanding its importance, being able to value what diversity is, and taking it to heart. When we look at equity, I like to think of it in terms of when we look again at students, what does an individual need? We're not all cookie cutter individuals that need the same resources. So for me, equity is looking at an individual, talking and forming that relationship to understand what might they need that's going to complement their success. Inclusion is similar but very different. It's how do we all mix? How do we all make it work as a large institution with full of diversity, full of students, full of faculty, all coming from our lens and where we come from? How do we make that mix so that it can be bountiful and beautiful, and students can be successful, and we can go home and know that we make a difference?
Great. So Kelly, I see you nodding. So from the perspective of the work that you do in academic advising, and you've also done some great work with our My Dream Scholars, tell me what it means to you. How do you practice equity, inclusion, diversity? What does that mean?
To me, inclusion is the one that I like to start with. I like to go in and really look and get to know a person, start talking with them, develop and cultivate a relationship with that student to understand, okay, what's their story? What's their background? And then once you get a little bit of those keys in, you can better fine tune their personalized experience to make sure that, do they have the access? Do they have the encouragement? Do they have the tools? Do they know what their next steps are in order to make sure that they have the best possible experience here, so we can keep them here and get them to be a graduated student? Because nothing beats hearing your name across when you're walking across that stage. And that's what I would tell my Dream students every day. I cannot wait to hear your name called across that stage. With diversity, it's going in and understanding that we are not all the same. We are, and recognizing those differences in a given setting and understanding, okay, what's the best way that we can make all this work together and succeed as a team and as a unit? And with the, just learning how do you feel valued? What's the best way to make a person feel valued? And that's why I'm so glad to be a part of this team and have this experience.
Awesome, thank you. Anything you'd like to add, Eddie?
Yeah, happy to. I think thank you for kind of helping me think too a little bit about what do we mean when we say inclusion, and what role does that play in equity. Because I start to think about some of the things that we look at when we're working with our campus partners. And I'm going to speak in the classroom, but we work all over the institution. But even thinking about inclusion, who's represented in the curriculum, whose lived experience is represented in the math problems that people are working with every day, whose faces are seen in the pictures of past presidents, who speaks in the classroom? Like, how do an instructor's facilitation strategies ensure that there's racial equity in who's speaking and whose voice matters in that classroom? And so I'm completely with you in the idea that inclusion matters, and people's different lived experiences matters. And I think equity is then not only recognizing and valuing those differences, but going further to ensure that the institution itself, the people, the practitioners themselves, are creating an environment where everybody feels represented, everybody feels valued, everybody is participating, and everybody's graduating and transferring and receiving and meeting those important outcomes.
Right.
Great. All right, so wonderful. That sounds really good. So when we think about equity, for us in Oklahoma, that was a new direction for Tulsa Community College, because we had spent so much time focusing on access, and then we kind of migrated into this world of completion. But taking or integrating equity into that meant that we had to dive a little bit deeper and start to disaggregate our data to find what student groups were experiencing inequitable outcomes. But could you talk to us, maybe, because you guys are leading this work across the nation, why is equity in student outcomes a national narrative at this point?
Well, when Estella Bensimon started the Center for Urban Education, the narrative, 20 years ago, the narrative wasn't equity; it was diversity, and she was very aware that although students of color had achieved access in many areas, and particularly in some community colleges because they're open access institutions, that there were other issues within the institution that needed to be addressed. And so really she was one of the first to really talk about equity, right? But it did become a national narrative because higher education is so important for the success, and closing equity gaps in education then translates to other things, to workforce, to income, to other inequities within the United States and within society. And so it's so important to provide the opportunity for students of color to become successful and to close other gaps that are in society more widely, that institutions really have to kind of look inward and see, all right, what can we do as an institution, as practitioners, to be able to give students kind of this opportunity to succeed and then to contribute to society, especially given that we are becoming a kind of majority-minority country very soon, right? That students, that people of color and the United States, being as diverse as it is, needs to compete globally, right? And that means being able to educate students and being able to dismantle kind of the racism that has existed thus far.
Right. So Debbie, with some of the institutions that you're working with, why equity? Why have they begun to focus on equity?
I think many of the institutions we work with, not only the ones we work with, but others, they know that they have inequities. Many of them see disaggregated transfer rates, disaggregated graduation rates, and they're increasingly being called upon by their states to report on it. So they're aware that this is something that's pressing, and it's something that we haven't necessarily as a society or as higher education have been able to fix yet. But what I think is really heartening is that a lot of people, everywhere we go, there are people saying we need to do something, and I think that's really empowering. I think the only other thing I want to add is that we're really intentional as a part of this greater kind of narrative to always couple what we do with disaggregated data, because it's easy to kind of think everything's okay. But when you start looking at that data, and not just graduation and transfer rates, but really get into course success rates, who visits my tutoring center, and so on, that really kind of allows us to live in a space that's not, I don't say anecdotal in a bad way, but unless you really see this disaggregated by race and ethnicity, you don't really know where inequities are emerging. And it's not to say that inequities are emerging everywhere. There are spaces that are serving equity, and they then become the people that we want to study. We want to learn from them. What is it about their practices that ensure that minoritized groups feel welcome, feel supported, feel valued, and so on. So just kind of saying that the national narrative also needs to be about disaggregated data that's close to practice.
Wonderful. So here at TCC, when we begin to look at our data a few years back, we started with disaggregated data because we were reorganized under the work of Dr. Clayton, and Dr. Goodson led that work, and we became a department for the first time. And part of our charge was to really be there to provide personalized support services for our underrepresented and underserved groups. In order to do that, we needed to disaggregate the data to figure out what is the need here at TCC, because we serve such a diverse body of students. And so we're a very small but mighty team. And with that, we had to prioritize our work. And that caused some consternation here in trying to figure out, why do you have a focus on students of color? Or why do you have a focus on first generation students? Why do you have a focus on students experiencing poverty? And so what we found when we looked at the data is that even when we looked at first generation students, low income students, those student groups, once we disaggregated it, our students of color still had the highest attrition rate. And so that meant we needed to ask deeper questions, and because we didn't want to come in with the assumption that, well, if the longitudinal data, the disaggregated data shares that students of color are dropping out at the highest rate across your institution, does that mean that they just aren't able to learn? I mean, what's the narrative around that? And so when we looked at some additional data, we had some data that showed, I pulled a report of all of the students of color. This particular group was our African American students, because only 7.8% of those first time entering into the college were graduating in 3 years. So that group had the lowest performance, which was very concerning. But when I dove a little bit deeper in the data, one could come in with a deficit mindset and say, well, it's just because they're not capable of being successful at your institution. Well, why? Is it because of the skill set, the academic skill set, or lack thereof? And we were able to immediately identify students African American students who were enrolled in the spring, and they did not enroll in the fall. We wanted to know why. When we looked at that information, we were able to see many of them, they had more than 45 credit hours towards their degree, their associate's or their certificate, but they also had an extremely high GPA. All those that had a 2.0 to a 4.0, we had hundreds of students who had a 3.0 and above, but something as small as a $1,000 uncollected tuition hold on their account prevented them from enrolling. So asking more questions, it helped us to create a counter narrative to say these students are very capable of learning, they're very bright, but they need certain personalized support. So if it's something as small as $300, you have a 4.0 GPA, we should be able to come up with the funds to be able to help you attain your degree by providing a completion grant. So that's an intervention that we could implement, that we're in the process of implementing. But those were some of the pieces that showed us, well, why race? Because when we disaggregate our data across all subsets, this group was showing us that as they entered the college, they weren't competing, or they weren't completing at an equitable rate. And so therefore, one of the initiatives was to reach out and to partner with CUE. So we're very excited about this work, but we also share with our stakeholders that this isn't the only intervention that we're doing. This isn't the only work that we're doing, but this is very important work that we are prioritizing, because we need, as a city, as a state, and as a nation, to graduate more students of color, graduates of color, because we know, as Esmeralda said, this is our emerging majority group. And so if we are not able to educate and graduate them, we will not be able to compete globally like we have in the past. And so we're going to go over to Pat and Kelly, and could you share some of the challenges that you have experienced with some of our students of color? So when you've tried to get down to that question of where are we losing them on the pathway, and why are we losing them? Pat, I know you've done some instrumental work in doing some focus groups with our various student organizations that are culturally based. And what are some of the challenges that those students spoke of?
Students spoke of feeling as though they didn't matter. No one noticed if they were here or not. They talked about spending a day where no one spoke, no one smiled. So they wondered and felt as though they didn't matter. Talked to students who food insecurity was a real issue. Homelessness. They were concerned that they didn't see others who looked like them. They shared concerns that they just didn't feel connected in any way. They talked of their fear of speaking in a classroom. They weren't called on always. How do I talk to my professor? They talked of lack of family support. So they talked of things internally that was difficult to hear, if I'm honest with you. It was difficult to hear, yet things that we needed to hear so that we can make some plans. And then when they talked of external things going on in their lives, also difficult to hear, but we could also help them with resources, help problem solve, be there to be their champion, and really know that someone does care about them.
Anything else that you want?
It's my personal belief that difficult conversations can lead to wonderful and excellent results in the end run. Working with undocumented students predominantly at the Outreach Center in my past work yielded me the experience to understand that some students are just afraid to speak up, or don't know how to navigate the financial aid system, or just it's the start to finish. I don't know what to do. Where do I go from here? And so it's guiding those the students along and making sure that you feel heard, you feel listened to, and I'm here. I will be your champion. I will listen to you. I'm here to help you. My thing, I want to see students succeed. I take that as in a selfish manner, to where their success is my success, and when they succeed, I mean, the smile on my face is genuine when I see a student succeed. And so by learning and having those difficult conversations and asking those questions, well, why do you feel that way? What has led you to feel that way? What do you think we can do differently in order to make sure that that feeling stops with you?
You know, I have a student when the semester started that came by the office. She was just wandering, and I got to visit with her, and it was her first semester. She was the first student in her family to come to school. She happened to be an African-American female, and so just visited with her, just talked. She has been by my office every day since about mid-afternoon to just breeze in, to say hello, tell me how her day's going, or I'm stuck with this. What is work study? And it has been, when I go home at night, I think about her often, that and yes, I'm working at getting her connected, but I feel honored that she comes by to see me and to check and say hello and ask me how I am, and to feel some of that connection. So you're right, it is meaningful, and it is what gives, fuels the passion of my work. And know that, and to know that that engagement and that relationship building is crucial.
It drives student success.
It drives
Absolutely.
student success, absolutely.
So Debbie and Esmeralda, what does the research say? I mean, when they've talked about some of the challenges that the students have encountered here at TCC, but when we think about maybe the classroom experience, what are some of those challenges that you've noticed across institution that this particular demographic, this particular group is grappling with, is, encountering when they are on their journey to education degree completion?
Yeah, sure. I can speak to it kind of more broadly, and then maybe you can provide some examples. But it's very similar. So what you were describing is, a lot of students of color experience microaggressions every day, which are kind of everyday slights that may not be intended to be about race even, but makes a student think, you know, did that person say that because I'm African American or because I'm Native or because I'm
Could you give us an
Latina?
example?
For example, if a student goes to a counselor, for example, and the counselor, you know, suggests that that they go to. So if a Latina student, for example, goes to a counselor and they suggest an ESL class or something, you know, even though that seems even a little bit more obvious, it's still a kind of an everyday occurrence, and whether it was intended or not doesn't really matter. What matters is the way that students are kind of taking all of this information in. Another similar idea is stereotype threat. So, for example, and that's kind of the worry that that when you are doing something that it's kind of going to be emblematic of your entire group. So, say, you know, there's an African American student who does poorly on a math test, you know, or is about to do a math test, and there's that pressure that if I do badly, this is going to reflect on all kind of African American students, and that is like a pressure that students of color kind of feel every day, and so what practitioners have to do, what faculty in the classrooms and counselors and tutors have to do is really mitigate some of those effects by really validating students, making sure they feel welcome in the classroom, feeling like they're a partner in their learning. So that student that comes by your door every day is really, you know, looking and feels like you're a partner in her success, right? And so we want more students to feel like they are represented, like they are validated and welcomed on campus, and that's so important for the success of students of color. Some people do make it through in spite of that, but we don't want that to be the case. We, as practitioners, want to be the people who are really inspiring and being able to create that environment for students.
And that sounds so easy. I mean, I keep hearing you all saying you just need to make sure they feel validated. You need to make sure that they feel welcome. Debbie, in your experience, when you go to the institutions and work with the stakeholders there, are they finding it an easy task or?
I think one of the things that we often talk about at the center is how teacher-instructor training doesn't really take on this kind of interpersonal relational component and how important it is. Listening to the student interviews you did with minoritized students and how it really mattered to them that people were communicating that they cared about them and they valued them. And the research that you were describing says the same thing. We see it over and over. African American, Latinx, Native American students want to feel like their faculty believe they can be successful, want to feel like they're welcome in the classroom, want to feel like they're cared for. And it's just not necessarily something that faculty have been trained to pay attention to, nor is it something that institutions themselves kind of ensure their space to provide training on or discussions about. And so some of the things that we do with we take an inquiry approach. We were talking about quantitative data, outcome data before, but we also couple that with more qualitative observation data, because that's where you really start to see what is it that the instructor or the staff are unintentionally perhaps communicating? What is it about their facilitation strategies that might not be kind of taking on this needed support? So for example, one of the campuses that I'm working with recently, we had them just pair up and observe each other's classrooms and count who speaks by race and ethnicity, who does the instructor go and talk to by race and ethnicity, and interesting things emerged. In many of the classrooms, it was predominantly white males that were speaking, and we can talk about that in terms of like societal privilege, who in the past has received messages that they are welcome in that space, that what they say matters, who doesn't have to like face this fear of experiencing a microaggression or a stereotype threat, who in the past has learned to like be silent for fear that they might have to manage that. And so it's then it's these observation activities or looking at disaggregated data, or sometimes we just watch instructors to see what they're saying, because they might unintentionally say things that might be a little cruel, like not cruel, but I think everyone can think back to a classroom they were in and they got messages from the instructor that hit them really hard, and the instructor might not have meant it. And so it's that kind of examination that positions instructors to think differently about what they're doing. Maybe I need to experiment with a different kind of call and answer strategy. Maybe I need to encourage students to talk together rather than just ask who's willing to speak, because that might empower students who've been empowered by our system to speak more. Maybe they need to do a little bit more when facilitating group work to make sure that there aren't students kind of left out and allowed to perhaps feel bias from their peers who live in a society where we have stereotypes about who's smart and who isn't. Maybe instructors need to pay attention to like where students sit in their classroom and who they go and talk to and who they kind of build relationships with. These things can go a really long way in setting students up for success and ensuring they feel engaged and welcome in that classroom.
Right.
That's awesome. I think you articulated that very well. I'm sitting there nodding my head, thinking about some of the experiences I have. It called to mind for me when I was in the process of completing my coursework for my PhD, and I remember being in a doctoral class, very small class, about 7 students in the class. I was the only student of color. And I remember every time I would ask a question, I mean, like I said, small, 7 folks in the room, my faculty member would always look at everyone else and answer the question. And so the first time he did it, I was like, okay, well, I mean, there's 7 of us. I apparently asked the question, but he'd answer and he'd look at this person, then he'd look at this person. But after about the second or third time that I asked a question over the semester, I was like, wow, it wasn't intentional. I didn't believe, I work in the field, so I was at least positioned to know that this was something that he was unconsciously doing. But the message that it sent to me was that, wow, when I ask a question, I can't even get eye contact for this answer. It can really start to make you feel, less valued, or that your contributions aren't appreciated in the classroom space. And so when you think of that, I'm going to wrap up with this question that I'd like each one of you to kind of answer. What is something from your perspective of being a staff member, a faculty member, that a person, an equity advocate, an equity champion could do to really help move this work forward? And I'm particularly interested in our faculty members. So if I'm a faculty member in a classroom and I feel like, well, one, I don't see color, I refuse to see color, because I treat all of my students the same. And then I hear you folks coming from California telling us that we need to be race conscious. I hear you folks that work in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion tell us that we need to be mindful and be equity minded in the sense of recognizing that each student brings a different lived experience. That all sounds good, but when I'm teaching my curriculum, it has nothing to do with race. It has nothing to do with culture. So why are you bringing this into my space? When you have those folks who are well-intended and wanting to treat all students the same, but maybe you get them for a couple of minutes to say, okay, well, I'll entertain you for a couple of minutes. What's something that you would challenge me to do? What's a tool that you would provide me with that you think would really help advance the student of color experience in the classroom to move them closer towards their goal of completion? What is it that you would ask of me? I want to wrap up with that question and provide each one of you the opportunity to just kind of share something that someone that may be watching can take home, can take to their classroom and use. And so I'll just kind of open it up to whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I think the first step is really to look at their data, to ask for their data and to look for their data, because the data will start to tell some of the story, right? So if you're an instructor and you've never seen your data disaggregated by race, an instructor that does get that data may find that they actually do have there are differences in their student success based on race, and if you look back, a number of years to see whether that's a pattern, throughout your teaching, and that's usually a big wake-up call for a lot of the faculty that we're working with. Faculty of all races that look at their data and realize that, there may be something that I do have to think about. What is the next step
Does
after
that
looking
mean
at
I'm
the
racist,
data?
Esmeralda? If I look at my data and I begin to see over the years so are you trying to say if I see that data, then I must be racist? Is that what this process is about, the work that you do at CUE?
No, absolutely not. What it is about kind of realizing that the ways that things are usually done and the way that we've been socialized through our higher education experience may not be the best way to teach. And for many faculty, even, we weren't taught how to teach, right? And weren't taught to think about race. On the other side, the idea is to be colorblind, right? But we find that really starts to hide. If you don't think that there's a problem in the first place, then you can't solve the problem, right? So first is thinking, whether there is a problem, is understanding whether there is a problem, and the data can help you to understand that. The second part of that is, of course, looking at that data and knowing that that is not a reflection of the student, that many times that faculty members do have a lot of agency in their classroom to be able to change that data and to close those equity gaps. And with that, I'll probably give it to Debbie to give some more detail on that.
Yeah, getting the disaggregated data and looking at it matters. I think another piece too that's become really important for us is having faculty teams come together and kind of talk about what's showing up in their data. Because one of the things that is just so, I think, consistent and interesting is how different instructors produce different racialized outcomes. And to me, I think that says there's something to the racialized culture of the classrooms that's producing something different from one instructor to the next. It's not the student. There's something going on about those environments that we need to better understand. You'll see an instructor who's doing great, producing equitable outcomes with their African American students, but gaps with their Latinx, or vice versa. Or there's instructors who have no gaps. And what I think, in addition to the data, an important tool is approaching this as kind of an inquiry research question, an inquiry and research process. Can I go and observe other instructors' classrooms to better understand what their practices are and how it's different from mine, and why they might be doing something that better connects with the students that I perhaps have gaps with? I think that's something that really has struck me too in this work, is how uncommon it is for instructors to go observe each other and just kind of learn about different ways of doing instruction. There's many different ways, and they each kind of contribute to a different classroom culture. And as we work with instructors to experiment with changing what they do, they also see differences in what outcomes they produce. We have instructors who are closing their gaps by experimenting with new kind of classroom facilitation strategies, new relationships, new structures. And so there's something really powerful in that data and just inquiry. Learn more.
Mm-hmm. That's great. All right, so we'll transition over to our TCC colleagues. And so from your experience, you both have been tremendous leaders in the work of inclusion and now transitioning into equity. What is it that you feel like, because you do it so well, what is something that you can share that you do that may be helpful for others, that this work is new, that they're just now coming around to being a little bit open about this inquiry thing that we're talking about and how we interact with students that can, our institutional responsibility for their success. What are some practices that you implement on a daily basis that others could imitate? And
I really, really appreciated your response about looking at the data and not being afraid. I think sometimes we're afraid of what we might see, as though somehow it has a judgment of who I am. We've got great faculty here. We need to get comfortable with that. But for me personally, I will share something I started doing after I heard the students share that they spent days or a day, they could go through a day and no one smiled and said hello. And it was something I had noticed that I wasn't doing. So when I walked the halls, I would speak. Some of that is who I am. But what I do now is I speak with direct eye contact. I speak looking for a response. I look and I'm in a more welcoming, let's speak a little bit. And if I'm not getting a response, I will try to engage that student, and that's very intentional. And I'm a very friendly, outgoing person. I would have not have thought to myself that I need to be more intentional. But I think being intentional in the classroom, greeting each student as they come in, have that eye contact, because the eye contact matters. I see you. I see all of you. And I've really been more intentional, and I see that students, I can see they like that. I see they're looking back at me. Not everyone, but that's okay, because the student was spoken to and acknowledged and seen. So I think not being afraid or taking it as the data is somehow equals I'm less than or I'm doing something wrong, but using it to grow and learn from and continuing the passion and the great teaching that we're doing, but doing it unafraid and willing to learn and being intentional. And there's probably lots of other bullets, but go ahead.
I have a different perspective to where I was actually a student here and graduated here. And so I had several great interactions in my student process of going, wow, they really made me feel listened to or heard. And so when I'm walking through the halls or say through the cafeteria and I see a student maybe sitting there kind of looking around, I will go over and sit down and say, hey, how's your day going? What kind of classes are you doing? How are you going along? Is there anything that I can do? Do you have any questions? Or if you're seeing a student kind of wandering around with that look on their face, reach out or just not be afraid. And I walk up to students all the time and say, hey, high five. And just, I'm Kelly, I'm from advisement. Do you need anything? Or just reaching out and making attempts to connect with people. Just that connection can make all the difference. We've all had those days to where that one person smiles, looks at you, makes that eye contact, and you're like, okay, today's not such a bad day.
Right.
I'm right where I'm supposed to be in this moment.
Right.
And by doing that for others, when people have done that for me, I really enjoy being able to do that for people and for students here.
Right. Wonderful. Great. Well, everyone, thank you so much. I hope that you all find this helpful, that there are some strategies, some tips that you can implement, or just simply new knowledge that you will think about a little deeper, you'll unpack a little more. And that concludes our time today. Thank you for joining us.